So now we're going to turn to Thomas Aquinas on human problem and right relationship. And as we do Thomas Aquinas, I want you to think of him as um, being sort of between, not just chronologically, but also in some ways conceptually, Augustine and Luther. So we're going to see Aquinas dealing with the kind of theological landscape laid out by Augustine. But when we get to Luther, we'll also see how Luther reacts against someone like Aquinas. So he's occupying this middle place between two people who we've talked about in the class before. I want to start when thinking about Aquinas on these questions by looking at some architecture. So this is Romanesque architecture, the kind that was really prevalent before Aquinas' time. And you see there a big God sitting on the throne in judgment, and kind of little people kind of hovering, shriveled by God. Contrast that with Gothic architecture, the architecture of Aquinas' era, where you have God sitting up there on a throne, but look at the people sitting below. Those are people who are upright and they're talking and they have books. That tells us something about Aquinas' moment. Aquinas certainly believed in sin, as we'll see, but he's also very interested in sorting out exactly what's happened to people in the fall, what they've retained from their way they were created, what they've lost, and in many ways he has a pretty optimistic view of human nature, certainly as compared to the kind of shriveled, we're quaking in the fear of God's wrath. Aquinas is going to be interested in really delineated what was lost, what wasn't, what good can we say about humans even under the fall, what do we need to say is still wrong. So, again, a big picture. Aquinas works within an Augustinian perspective, so he's going to work with predestination. He softens it somewhat from the late Augustine, but he's working within that landscape. It's the landscape he knows. He's also assuming original guilt, so he is operating under the sense that people are born guilty. Aquinas is interested in precision. You probably got that from his writings. He's interested in being very, very precise. What exactly went wrong? What has to happen? That's going to set up a comparison with Luther. Luther, as we'll see, is going to be much more interested in just saying, before God, there's nothing really good to say about humanity, right? When you contrast sinful humanity with God, you're not going to say anything good about humanity. Aquinas is actually going to sort of really be precise. Well, no, let's get exactly what went wrong. So when we can come to a point later when we're contrasting Aquinas and Luther, there's differences in theology, there's differences in temperament, there's differences in tone. Okay, so the first thing we have to sort through for Aquinas, and if we were still doing this in class, I would have had you read some of this in Aquinas, but we're not in class, and so I'm just going to explain it to you. If you're interested in looking at these texts, I'm happy to give them to you. So, before sin, what was the human condition? Well, we had the constitutive principles of nature, like we had reason, and we had the ability to, have our minds, tell our bodies what to do, those kinds of things. We had what he calls the inclination to virtue. In other words, we were inclined towards the good. We were inclined towards God. We were inclined to do what we were supposed to do. And original justice, meaning we were in a right relationship with God. God said that we were in right relationship with him. After sin, we still have the constitutive principles of nature. We still have reason. It's a little bit complicated because that reason and virtue go together, but we still have it. We can still do math, right? We can still figure out how to diagram a sentence for Aquinas. Like that hasn't changed. So we're still human in that sense. Our inclination to virtue, however, has been diminished. We don't have this strong inclination to virtue. we're now more inclined away from the good. What we have lost is original justice. We're not in a right relationship with God. We are in a wrong relationship with God. And again, working in with an Augustinian framework, we are guilty for that. It's not just that we don't have the relationship, it's that we don't have it and we're guilty. We are damned for that. The next thing then Aquinas is going to want to figure out is, what is the role of grace for humans both before the fall and after the fall, or before sin and after sin? For what do we need grace before the fall, if anything? For what do we need grace after the fall? Well, what could we do without grace before sin? According to Aquinas, we could fulfill the commands, like the 10 Commandments, with respect to the command alone. And what Aquinas means by that is that we could do what we were supposed to do. We couldn't do it out of love without grace. We couldn't do it out of what he calls charity, which doesn't mean giving to people in need for Aquinas, but it's out of love for God. Without grace before sin, we could avoid both mortal and venial sins. These are two different kinds of sins. One thing about mortal sin is sin that separates you from God, and venial sin as sin that is wrong but doesn't actually destroy the relationship. However, even though we could avoid both mortal and venial sin, we would still need God preserving us in existence. So you were able to not to commit mortal and venial sin, but the only reason you existed in order to be able to avoid committing either is because of God. For Aquinas, before sin with grace, we could fulfill commands with respect to the manner of action, which means with supernatural virtue. We could do things in love. All of what this means is that for Aquinas, even before the fall, we needed grace. There is not for Aquinas a moment where humans were doing just fine on their own and didn't need God. At the very least, you need God simply to be, as we saw in his understanding of God. God gives you existence moment to moment. You have no existence without God, so you need that. But even then, you need, if you're going to fulfill God's commands in charity, which is what God wants, that always needs grace. You always need the grace of God to do that. So there was never a point where we didn't need grace. However, after sin for Aquinas, certainly we needed grace more. Without grace after sin, we can avoid mortal sin for a time, but not for long. So for Aquinas, like, you're not going to do every bad thing that comes your way. You're not necessarily going to be, as bad as you could possibly be, but you're going to do bad things after sin without grace. You just aren't going to be able to help yourself. With grace after sin, you'll be able to fulfill commands with respect to the manner of action, so with supernatural virtue, same thing as before, and you can be healed and avoid mortal but not venial sin. So God's grace heals you, you'll be able to avoid mortal sin, but you won't, there are still things you're going to do wrong. We're just still somewhat broken, and grace helps us, but those issues of the fall still reside with us. So all of which is to say, again, that for Aquinas, there is never, never, never a moment where you don't need God or you don't need grace. Never, never, never. But again, he's interested in precision. What that means changes after the fall, and our need for grace increases after the fall. All right, so I'm going to say that all again. Sin has damaged, not destroyed our natural abilities. Reason has not been obliterated, and reason does orient us towards the good. According to Aquinas, you only can really reasonably want the good. The problem after the fall is that we really misread what the good is. But Aquinas thinks that if you really know the good, you will do the good. The problem is after the fall, we aren't really convinced of what the good is. After the fall, we can still do good in the world. So according to Aquinas, even in a state of corrupt nature, that means after the fall, a man can do some particular good by the power of his own nature, such as build houses, plant vineyards, and things of this kind. So yeah, I mean, the world keeps functioning. The problem for Aquinas is that we aren't doing the right things for the right reasons in the right ways all the time. And he said you still have cardinal virtues, not supernatural virtues. Those are things like love, but cardinal virtues, justice, prudence, temperance, and fortitude. So sure, right? Like there were good Roman philosophers or Greek philosophers who did justice and were prudent people. They could do that. They had those virtues. What they didn't have is sort of the supernatural charity of God. All right. So what is Aquinas then saying about nature and grace, right? Again, this is all, I'm trying to say the same thing in multiple ways because I know it's a little confusing. So for Aquinas, you can understand grace in two ways. Divine help by which God moves us to do and to will the good, and as a habitual gift divinely bestowed upon us. In other words, for Aquinas, grace is both God turning us back to God and saying, you were, inclined away from me, I'm turning you back, and now I'm giving you grace just continually so that you are now habitually choosing the good. I'm reforming your habits, reforming your inclination in line with God. And that's for two reasons. Beatitude demands supernatural or theological virtues, faith, hope, and love. And these come to us from God. God infuses us with grace, hope, and love, which means that with grace, we are changed from the kind of people who don't have faith, hope, and love to the kind of people who do. We are actually, the kinds of people we are changed by grace. And again, Aquinas would say you need that infusion in both pure nature and corrupt nature. No point at which you didn't need God. Okay? So here I've got these two bars. The pure nature, as you can see, this is before the fall. You can get to original righteousness, so not doing bad things, kind of on kind of just being human. To get to supernatural virtue, though, you still need God's help, and to exist at all, you need God's help. In corrupt nature, you need God's help even to get to original righteousness. There's just nothing you can do to get even there without the grace of God. So again, you need more grace after the fall, but you always needed grace. For those of you who are wondering, like, why would you keep talking about that? We will contrast Aquinas with some of the Catholic thinkers that come after him, and who are going to make it sound like you can actually do a lot more without grace. And it is those thinkers that Luther is particularly reacting against. Luther probably wouldn't like Aquinas either, or didn't, but he's particularly reacting to people who, after Aquinas, really say you can do a lot on your own without grace. Aquinas is not quite saying that. Doesn't mean Aquinas and Luther would have been friends, just means that Aquinas and Luther are closer than some of the people who came after Aquinas and Luther were. Okay, so what is justification for Aquinas? Well, justification, simply put, is when we're declared right with God. When God says, you have gone from being in a wrong relationship with me to a right relationship, right? Justification just means to be aligned with or put into line. Okay? So, gotta love my little slide here. I worked hard on this art for y'all, just so you know. For Aquinas, a justification is a real change. And here's what I mean. Again, after the fall, we're inclined away from the good, away from God. We're heading this way, and we don't have charity. Okay, that's our status before the fall. Inclined away from the good, we don't have charity. In justification, God comes, moves us towards justice, like really goes whoosh, and then infuses us with hope, love, and charity. No, hope, faith, and charity. And we begin to move closer and closer to the good. We become better and better people. We become holy and holier people. And somewhere along that line, justification happens. So justification isn't simply the moment of saying, oh, you're going to look at me, but it's something that happens as we become better people. Luther will be different. So, again, want to say what Aquinas is. God comes, you're, doing your own thing, not caring about God. God comes, moves you to justice, and then infuses you, puts love, faith, and hope into you. And as you become a holier and holier person, God says, okay, now we're okay. That means justification demands infused or habitual grace. Importantly for Aquinas, God is justifying you based on something that God has done. If you remember way back when we talked about Pelagius, right? Pelagius sort of made it sound like we could be justified based on what we did all by ourselves. Remember Nike theology? Just do it. Aquinas is still saying, like, God does this in us, but we cooperate with it. So God is infusing this with us, and we help it along by responding to it. In Aquinas' time, that would mean like God is giving you love and faith and hope, and you're going to Mass and receiving the Eucharist, or you're going to confession. You're doing those things that cooperate with what God is doing in you. But God is doing those things. Mm-hmm. For Aquinas, then, God rewards our merit, but God is rewarding what God has enabled people to do. So it's kind of like this. Being at home a lot, my son makes a lot of messes, and then it's time to clean up. Cleaning up is not as fun as making the messes. So there's a lot of conversations in our house that go like this. Hey, Elliot, let's clean up the room, right? And Elliot picks up a few things, and I pick up like 95% of the things. But then to encourage Elliot to continue to be the kind of person who picks up, I'm like, hey, you did it! I'm kind of rewarding my own acts there. Like I helped him clean up. He's now bouncing, coming in here. I'm pausing. I'm back. So again, right, for Aquinas, God is rewarding us with justification for the work that God has really done in us. Again, after Aquinas, other theologians will say something different, and then Luther is going to say something different again. So just watch for that. But that's what Aquinas says. Okay, I think we did it. Aquinas on justification. Here again is the key point, and we'll say this again when we get to our chart. For Aquinas, justification demands becoming a different kind of person, a holier person, a better person. The technical word here we use is sanctification. There is a real change in you, and God, at some point as you're getting better, says, and we are okay. As you can imagine, there are going to be people like Luther who are going to wonder, and exactly where in that spectrum does that happen? But for Aquinas, it's important that justification comes, A, because of the grace of God, and B, because we cooperate with that grace and we are actually changed.